Fantastic. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Yeah, so great start for a technical talk. I cannot turn on a microphone. Hopefully the rest of the talk will go more smoothly. Yeah, I'm conscious of time always flies, so I'm going to get right into it. Thank you all for coming. Today we're going to be talking about Microsoft Excel. If you don't think that's really cool and interesting, then you're free to leave, but do so quickly to not disturb the others. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about how to balance a complex strategy game today. Introductions to begin with. I'm William Dyce. I have spent nearly 11 years now in the games industry, including 7 at Amplitude Studios up in Paris. And I've been mostly working as a designer, doing game and system design and AI design on various strategy games. Some of these you might have heard of. Oops, sorry. Skipping ahead there a little bit. So Humankind most famously came out quite recently. We've also got all the Endless games, so Endless Space 2, Endless Legend, a lot of expansions on that, and a few other things that unfortunately never made the cut. Before that, I worked on karaoke games, and before that, I worked on games for stroke rehabilitation. So it's been a bit of a bumpy ride. And recently, I've been working on Solium Infernum, the diplomatic strategy game from hell at League of Geeks down here in Melbourne. So this is a favorite of mine. It actually became kind of a days since Will has mentioned Solium Infernum at Amplitude type thing. I kept bringing it up, and there's a whole bunch of mechanics that I stole from Solium for all the Endless games. And so it's a really interesting full circle now to be back working on the remake. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about content balancing for strategy games, more specifically. Trying to get into something that's quite technical, that has some useful takeaways for everyone. I noticed some people are taking pictures. Anthony up the back there recommended that I put this little camera icon when the slide is finished. So a lot of these slides will be progressive. When the slide is ready for you to take a picture, there'll be this little icon. But I'll put them up online somewhere as well so that you can get hold of them if you need them. Because I'll admit they're quite dense. I like putting a lot of text on them. Again, I'll give these to you so you can read them at your leisure. I'm going to be talking about balancing, but I actually prefer the term tuning, which is a term that League of Geeks uses a lot for this. And I think it's actually a better word. Because when you talk about balancing, the tendency is to think in terms of fairness, right? Is this piece of content or is this strategy fair? Is it overpowered? Is the cost right, etc.? But that's not the only thing that's of interest to us when we're tuning. Even when we're tuning a strategy game, because obviously tuning a racing game, there are all kinds of kind of 3 Cs, game feel type things. So we want fairness, but we also want pacing. We want really powerful, interesting content to show up at the end of the game. We don't want all the toys to be available from the beginning. We want to have this nice kind of Freytag pyramid, this interest curve that builds to paroxysm. We also want to have variety, and I suppose pacing is a kind of temporal variety in a way. But you don't want to have just a whole bunch of content that is interchangeable from the player's perspective. And tuning is another way of providing this. And also a little bit more of a subtle one is the concept of resonance. And so Mark Rosewater talks about this a little bit in his 20 Years, 20 Lessons talk. To give you the example here, we have this wonderful art here of the Hounds of Hell on the right. One would expect something that looks like this to go quite quickly and to be quite bitey, right? So you need to have a correspondence between the values that you choose and what this thing looks like and what it represents for the lore. If you don't, it's going to feel off. And that is part of tuning as well, right? So you're juggling all of these different objectives in your mind when you're choosing these values. It's not an easy process, it's quite an interesting process, and that's what we're here to talk about. So even more specifically, I want to focus on what I call rational tuning, which is the use of mathematical models to empower us. It's the theme. In the pursuit of those goals, whatever those goals might be. And the actual particular goal that I am going to be looking at is fairness. It's not all these other ones, because it's probably the simplest one to do math for. But I believe that you can use all of these techniques for any of these things, because from an abstract point of view, it's about modeling how well you've accomplished a given goal. So yeah, rational tuning is a kind of nod to Ubisoft's rational game design. I don't know if anyone's heard of rational level design here. Hands up if you have. Right, a few people. As I said, I spent 13 years in France, so this whole kind of Cartesian mentality is sort of seeped into my brain. I've also worked on AI quite a lot, so the idea of using sort of heuristics to calculate how powerful something is very natural to me. And obviously Ubisoft is a French company, so this idea of designing in a rational way is very, very French. So yeah, rational level design. Goodness, sorry. I'm trembling a little bit, and it's making me press it multiple times, so sorry. It's a great honor to be in such an austere company, and obviously I'm a little bit nervous. So please, I beg your forgiveness. Yeah, rational level design, it essentially involves modeling how difficult a given encounter was. If you were here for Maro's talk, he talked a little bit about flow theory, Csikszentmihalyi, and all that. So the idea is that you associate a level of difficulty with different game elements, and then the specific way that they're combined together gives you an idea of how difficult a given encounter is. Are there any D&D players here? Oh, okay, so challenge rating. I would define challenge rating as a kind of rational tuning. So it's associating a numeric value with something like challenge, which is more of a subjective feeling, right? So it's nothing particularly new, but I'm just giving it a name. So an example of rational tuning in a strategy game like Solium Infernum would be the use of power curves. Now, who's heard of a power curve? Fantastic. Yeah, so Magic the Gathering, Hearthstone, they have this idea of place all the cards on a curve of power and cost. If things are on the curve, it means that they are, correctly costed. In this case, we have the Hounds of Hell here that are clearly off the curve, and that would prompt us to, we could bring their power down, or we could bring their cost up, so that they're not either, undercosted or overpowered. And so this is essentially a tool that allows us to know, when our content is a little bit off, by purely mathematical means. So the process for using this kind of technique, I would say, goes as follows. At least this is how we deployed it on Solium. You start off by choosing your goals. A lot of junior designers will skip this step. It's an important one, because if you don't know what you're going for, then you're not going to achieve it. Step number 2 is going to be building some kind of model. And basically, the model is some kind of mathematical formula that's going to tell you how well you've accomplished your goal, right? So, to take the rational level design example, we want our encounters to grow gradually more difficult. Once again, we have that Freytag pyramid, that, growing intensity. And if we notice that we have an encounter in the late game that's extremely easy, then maybe that's a little bit off. And that's the mathematical model telling us, oh, okay, this isn't quite right. So yeah, then we tune our content, we build our levels, we choose the values on our military units, etc. Obviously, there's going to be some kind of iterative loop, because this is game development. Interestingly, here I say, you test your tuning, right, and you revise the model as necessary. This testing can be with actual play testers, but it can also be just a smoke check of you looking at the values and saying, hang on, that doesn't look right. There's something here that the model is not taking into consideration, right? Oh, can everyone hear me, by the way? I have a terrible habit of not understanding how microphones work. Yeah. And this evaluation, it is a heuristic evaluation. So once again, I'm really borrowing from that time spent on AI, this idea of some kind of metric that's built on the basis of a game context, a set of content, etc. That's something that you do all the time with AI. And so essentially I'm building an AI to evaluate my game design work, if that makes sense. Yeah, so ideally your model is going to outlive the specific tuning paths that you built it for. so that you can continue to add to it, improve it, etc., over the course of your development cycle. The ideal would be when you move on to another project, the game goes into live, you have some juniors come on board to do live support or something like that. They actually use the model. And if they use the model, it's a good model because, if they just abandon it, it was your toy that you were playing around with. Frankenstein reference here for those who know. Any modern Prometheus fans here? There's always one. Essentially all strategy games, all games in general, you're going to have a source of truth somewhere that QA is consulting about what the actual values should be for the game. It's probably a spreadsheet. Hopefully, it's not just someone's notebook. And so ideally, whenever someone goes in and modifies this, the model gets rerun, right? You rerun those metrics, kind of like when you push code to your GitLab or something like that. You're going to run auto tests to check it all, and that's all done automatically. You're not needing to do it manually. Which means, automation. We need some kind of number crunching engine to help us run all these tests, to sanity check the tuning that we've done. And as I've kind of spoiled earlier, I love Microsoft Excel with a passion. This is actually Solium Infernum's power curve. You'll notice that there are some things that are not on the curve. Any guesses why? You don't count.
Utility? Utility cards with special effects rather than pure power?
That is a very good guess, and that is more or less what the answer is. Yeah, these are one more possibility.
They're used to differentiate factions, so each faction has a bunch of power that's off the curve.
That's also a really interesting response. It is actually just starting legions. So all these personal guards are your starting legions. We've also got a few that are created through spells or created through events. So they don't actually have a cost in the traditional sense, so they're off the curve. We don't really mind that much that they're off the curve. The coloration, though, lets us say, well, the personal guards are orange, so they're, I think, level 3 legions, and we want them to be more or less level with the other level 3 legions. Just because I showed this to people before and they were like, oh, you showed us a power curve and then the power curve was like broken. That's intentional. Google Sheets, we use Google Sheets and Excel at League of Geeks. Google Sheets is a lot slower, and it's missing a few key features that I'm going to talk about today, but it's free, and it's really easy to have multi-user editing and a spreadsheet that's accessible by everyone with Google Sheets. I would, of course, argue that Excel also supports this, but it's a little bit tricky to set up. You need like a SharePoint and everything. Yeah. There's also LibreOffice Calc, but we don't talk about LibreOffice Calc. I say this as a fan of open source, a fan of Godot and GIMP and all that kind of, but no, don't inflict this on yourself. You deserve better. You deserve, programmers deserve Rider or Visual Studio, and designers deserve, good tools as well. Come on. So other things to consider: Progressimo, McDye, Machinations. Machinations is $90 a month. Excel's about $20 a month. So I'd honestly rather get Excel and buy my design team lunch multiple times a month. But yeah, Machinations is an interesting kind of Petri net simulation tool. Progressimo is currently in beta, but I would recommend it if you're doing like a branching narrative kind of structured game, because it's really good for detecting like dead ends. So I think, for instance, anyone playing Baldur's Gate 3? Yeah, so I don't see how they could possibly have achieved what they did without some kind of tooling that would detect all the areas where something could get broken. And McDye is kind of like a dice simulator, like a probabilistic simulator game. So it can tell you if I rolled 23 dice and whenever there was a 6, I re-rolled it and added all the numbers that I got, what are the odds that I get 100 or more? So that's really handy as well. And it's kind of like a graph-based tool, which is kind of cool. And it's like freemium-ish on itch.io. So check that out. Yeah, time flies, folks. Let's talk about Excel. So before I do, I need to talk a little bit about how Solium Infernum works, because you're not going to be able to appreciate this sort of why a given military unit is good or bad if I don't tell you how they're actually used in game. So these are our military units that I showed before. As a player, we are an evil archfiend trying to take over hell, and we do this by marching evil legions of demons against each other. So each legion is kind of like a military unit. And military units derive their value mostly from how well they do in a fight. So how do fights work in Solium Infernum? Well, essentially we have these 3 combat attributes from top to bottom, that is ranged, melee, and infernal. They are compared in sequence. After each comparison, the loser, so the one with a lower value, loses hit points equal to the difference. So to give you an example, well, I mean, who do you think is going to win here? Chains? Who votes for the Hounds of Hell? Yeah, they have pretty nice art. I would go for them just for the artwork. Who goes for Chains? Yeah, so if we sum all the values on the Chains card, we get a higher number overall. But as we'll see, that's not always going to be a good metric for telling us which one will win in Solium Infernum. So first of all, we compare the ranged attribute. Hounds of Hell have lost 2 hit points because 2 to 0. Next, the melee attribute. Chains of Torment lose 4 hit points. And finally, looks like the Hounds of Hell have lost. Sorry, folks. 4 to 0, 4 hit points. Often they only had 6 hit points to begin with. And that's all there is to it. But because of the structure of the game and the fact that everyone plans their orders simultaneously, so you have to sort of second guess what an opponent's going to do, this can lead to some quite interesting situations. And we'll discuss as well, just a match off between 2 legions, you could have one legion that is very good against another legion and very bad against another one, just on the basis of this very simple combat system. So now what we're going to do is we're going to try and basically build like a power metric, a heuristic value to evaluate each of these legions. As I kind of teased before, maybe we could just add up all the numbers on the card, right? The trouble with that is that the earlier phases, because you can be killed in an earlier phase and all your remaining attributes will be skipped, the earlier phases are worth more than the later phases, which means that we need to give them a higher weight when we create some kind of power, like utility value for each of these units. So here we have what the little Excel spreadsheet looks like with the 2 units we mentioned, Hounds of Hell and Chains of Torment, and their attributes. The resolution order here is left to right. So ranged, then melee, then infernal. And so we're going to want to have a higher weighting on ranged than melee or infernal. So first little formula looks something like this. Who has heard of the implicit intersection operator? That little at symbol. Well, it's a good thing I came along to explain how to Excel to people. Yes, so implicit intersection operator is the bee's knees. And if you take one thing away from this, it's that it's great. So basically what that formula is saying is the power heuristic of each of these legions is equal to 4 times their level, plus 8 times their hit points, plus 12 times their range, plus 11 times their melee, blah, 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 blah. You can actually read this formula without bleeding from your eyes. Whereas if I did this in Google Sheets, or God forbid in LibreOffice Calc, I would die. And I would die at this point in the talk. We're going to get much crazier than this. So yeah, Excel rules. Microsoft should totally be giving me money for this. So legions also have a special ability that can be taken into account. These little things here, infernal resistance, melee resistance. We've got arcane bulwark. We've got, how do you pronounce that word? I don't even know. Sorry, Anthony. True Sight, Lava Walker, all of these things going on, right? And we need to take these into consideration because they can make a huge impact on the power of the legion, right? So we can create a little table where we say, well, by hand, I'm going to assign a value to each of these powers, but I now need to associate in some manner that power to the legion, right? I can say, oh, this legion here has power number 1, But how do I take that 50 and kind of bring it into that power heuristic? Any suggestions? Yes, mister. Direct lookup, yes. It's going to be something lookup, right? It's going to be VLOOKUP. It's going to be, XLOOKUP. It's going to be match and index, so index of match of something. Anthony is always saying to me, so Anthony up the back, I keep trolling, what's the difference between XLOOKUP and VLOOKUP? So I looked it up in the documentation, and essentially the documentation says, XLOOKUP is like the better, newer, sexier version of VLOOKUP. And that is essentially what it is. It is, so if you're familiar with VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP's basically the same thing with a nicer syntax. It lets us find the value of a given records attribute. It's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially, if I want to, say, find the melee attribute of Legion number 1, the formula is going to look like this. Look up, find the 1 in Legion index, and return Legion melee. We've got square braces now. What's going on? Oh, jeez. So Legion index is this thing over here. We find the 1, and then we find the crossover with Legion melee, and we return 8. So these square braces that I mentioned are, they denote what are called structured references in Excel. This is another thing that Google Sheets doesn't have, which I hate. Google Sheets is fine. I'm being really mean to Google Sheets. I use it all the time. It's great. You can script things in JavaScript. But it doesn't have structured references, and that makes me very sad. Essentially, what a structured reference is I define this as a table, right? This whole thing, and it will automatically create named references or named ranges, what Google Sheets calls named ranges. So sort of variable names for my columns, which makes it really easy to find. To reference things. And I can just click on something, it'll automatically fill in the formula with the structured references, which is really nice. XLOOKUP, now that we know what it is, we can use it to grab the power value of our abilities. So we'll grab power value of ability number 1. Because we have blanks in here, we need a little if error wrapping that around. We could, of course, create a null ability 0, and then just put 0 whenever someone doesn't have an ability. But essentially, if error lets us return a default value. If ever there is an error in the formula, an XLOOKUP will return an error. If ever, I'm looking up blank in a list of indices. So that lets us define one ability per legion, right? What happens if we want to define multiple abilities per legion, which is, the case in this game, right? We saw that we had multiple abilities. And, this idea, abilities on legions is one thing, but you're going to have, all kinds of content that's subject to this kind of many-to-one or many-to-many relationship, right? So they might be cars with engine components. They might be characters with character traits. The idea is you have the provider and the provision, right? The thing that is associated with the other thing. So all this stuff doesn't just apply to strategy games. I would not recommend doing this, where we have ability 1, ability 2, ability, et cetera, et cetera. You find the highest number of abilities that a legion can have, and you create that many columns, because you end up with a whole bunch of blank columns, and it makes me sad, because I am a control freak. And also it makes your formulas look like this, which also makes me very sad. Now that's pretty illegible using structured references. Imagine doing that in LibreOffice Calc where you don't have structured references. It'd be very, very sad indeed. For those who are in engineering, you'll understand the concept of data hygiene. I would argue for data hygiene also in design. That is basically making sure that all your data is clean and consistent and structured the same way. Because if we want to do rational tuning, if we want to do a lot of this kind of tooling on top of our data, then we need to be able to have that data in like a machine-readable format. And this is not particularly machine-readable. So what is machine-readable? Glad you asked, audience member. What we're going to use is an associative table. Now, you might not know what an associative table is. I looked this up on Wikipedia. Associative tables are colloquially known under many names, including association table, bridge table, cross-reference table, crosswalk, intermediary table, intersection table, joint table, junction table, linking table, many-to-many resolver, map table, mapping table, pairing table, pivot table, as used incorrectly in Laverell, not to be confused with the correct use of pivot table in spreadsheets, or transition table. So no one can really decide. Thank you. No one can really decide what this thing is called, but it's a thing that does useful things. Basically, we have our Legion table, we have our table of abilities. They both have globally unique identifiers, which I've just called index. And then we have another table that just associates them together like this. So Legion number 4 has Legion number ability number 1, and it also has ability number 5. It has 2 abilities. And then what we can do, we can use our little XLOOKUP to grab the names and the power values. So grab the power value of the abilities into our little association table. And once we've done that, we can run a little sum ifs and get the sum of the powers of the abilities that match our Legion number. So for instance here, Legion number 4, its power heuristic from abilities is going to be the sum of all abilities such that in this table there is a 4, which is 50 plus minus 30, which is 20. Look how clean this formula is compared to the nonsense we had on the previous slide. Much better. So please do this. All right. Let's make tracks, running out of time. A sort of equivalent of sum ifs, but for text, is text join. I'm not going to explain exactly all of this formula, but essentially the idea is it kind of conditionally joins together a bunch of text. So here I'm concatenating together all the ability names for the abilities that the vial apostates has. And that's because QA isn't going to want to consult like a separate table and figure out what do the vial apostates, what are they supposed to have, based on this kind of like Legion index, ability index thing. They're going to want to have it in situ, if that makes sense. Be nice to QA, be nice to engineers. So yeah, all of these techniques come together to provide us with some really nice little sanity checks. So once we built this kind of structure, right, we can consult it to inform all kinds of design decisions, right, including creating future content. So here's one I made earlier. This is actually in Google Sheets. And this is our kind of source of truth reference for all of Solium Infernum's content. And this isn't just legions. It's also, there are various ways that an ability can be provided to a thing. And it's a really good way of keeping track of all the places that a given ability comes from, and also the sum of all of the modifications from abilities that touch in a given attribute. So to give a really clear example, here I have command rating, which I've highlighted, which is the number of legions that I'm able to control as a player. It's very important for the engineers and also the UI designers to know, well, what's the maximum number that a player can have, for performance reasons and also for ensuring that the UI can fit everything, right? So having this kind of central tracking sheet can allow us to answer that question really easily. I can only ever have 8. But also, we can look at these different effects and we can say, oh, it's interesting that, I don't know, charisma power, there's no relic that provides charisma power. Isn't that interesting? Maybe a future piece of content will add that. So we can identify areas where we may have missed things, and also we can look at, oh dear, we shouldn't add another thing that gives you command rating, because worst case scenario, they could be Beelzebub and have Wrath level 6 and also have the Bottle of Whispers and the Ring of Command. I'm not going to explain to you what all these artifacts, relics, etc. Go play the game. It's going to have a demo in October. That's for Blake. Play the game and then also buy it like 12 copies, please. So all good. We now have our power heuristic that takes into account both the attributes and the powers of our legions, right? So all good. We're all done. We're fine. This is the part where I say, or are we? All right, so let's return to something a little bit less Excel-y and a little bit more kind of high-level design-y, right? another term that might be useful, value anchors. This is something that's discussed in Schreiber and Romero's book, Game Balancing. So in the previous slides, I was assigning by hand a kind of numeric value to a bunch of special abilities, right? That's a bit tricky. You really have to go out on a limb for that kind of thing. Generally speaking, what experienced designers will tend to recommend is finding some kind of common currency that you can convert everything into, rather than handling some kind of abstract power value between 0 and infinity, or minus infinity and infinity, right? So a really common example of this would be like damage per second. I don't know if I have, like in an action RPG, I have weapons that attack a certain number of times per second, and I have damage that the weapon does. Well, I can calculate a damage per second value for each weapon, and that allows me to compare them all directly, rather than having to compare two different attributes. So that's the idea of a value anchor, basically. We all use them all the time without knowing, but if you have vocabulary, you can look smart. So I recommend throwing value anchor into your next meeting. And so, if I were, for instance, to convert, I don't know, ranged, infernal, melee, etc., if I could convert everything into, say, hit points or something, it would be a lot easier to sort of intuitively say, oh, okay, this one's worth 7 hit points, but I would rather, as a player, have 7 hit points than have this ability. So clearly something's off. The ability is overvalued, right? Whereas if something is worth 15 and something else is worth 17, I don't know what the scale is. I don't really understand, what's going on. Unfortunately, this doesn't really work for Solium, just because there are so many situations where a given ability or an attribute is completely worthless based on the context. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's an example of 2 legions that were in our table before, the Vile Apostates and the Chains of Torment. We can see the resonance here as well. These guys have ranged vulnerability and they look like party balloons. Anyway, that makes me laugh. But yeah, the Vile Apostates have an extremely high infernal value and quite high hit points. But in actual fact, because they have ranged vulnerability and because they have 0 ranged and 0 melee, they will actually be destroyed by the Chains of Torment before they even get a hit in. Unless, of course, we increase their ranged value by 2, which isn't a lot, in which case suddenly they will win. So the whole thing flips over. So, if they had 2 range, they wouldn't take any range damage. And if you have range vulnerability, then whenever you take range damage, you take extra damage. If that didn't happen, then we would win this battle. The graph looks something like this. So here we have the Vile Apostate's ranged attribute. We have the amount of damage dealt and taken. And we can see that there's this kind of, this like tipping point, right? It suddenly switches from one to the other. And the idea with creating a power heuristic, as a linear combination, we're using a value anchor and we're calculating everything into this common currency. That's a linear function, right? And this is not a linear function. We're not going to find a linear function that describes this. Damn. So tipping points, again, piece of vocabulary so you can seem smart in design meetings. A lot of this stuff is just stuff that I've made up, so it probably won't make you feel smart. Maybe it will. Tipping point is an idea often used in ecology systems analysis. I would really recommend the book Thinking in Systems. I think that's Janina Fisher. Absolutely read that book. There's all kinds of interesting examples of tipping points in that. The idea essentially is that you have a system, for instance, a game system, and there are various values that contribute to the behavior of this system. And when one is pushed to a given threshold, suddenly the entire system starts behaving in a new and exciting way. A really good example of this would be Path of Exile, right? Or any action RPG game. Who's played Diablo 4? Yeah, so you know what I mean. Basically, in that kind of game, you might have very few hit points, but a very high hit point regeneration per second. And so long as you are regenerating more hit points per second than the enemies are dealing damage per second to you, you are effectively an immortal god. But if ever you start taking slightly more damage than you are healing, then suddenly you are dead in a flash. And that's an example of a tipping point. So, another example would be when you move from, killing enemies in 2 hits to killing enemies in 1 hit, for example. As a player, if you can find and exploit a tipping point, that can cause a great deal of joy. I think one of the reasons people love throwing things around in Baldur's Gate 3 is because of this. The throw action, for instance, can be exceedingly effective if the person you're throwing is next to a giant vat of acid. Or exceedingly useless if they're not. The idea is that we can turn a difference of quantity into a difference in kind, and this is a really interesting way of creating super meaningful game systems on the cheap. I'm going to have to skip ahead. I can't really explain exactly what I mean by that, but there are times when essentially adding a +1 to something from the player's perspective can completely change how they approach a system. But from your perspective as a content creator, you've just added a +1 to something, right? I really should have prepared some examples of that. I don't know. As the Baldur's Gate 3 example shows, though, it's really hard to balance games with a lot of these tipping points. And Solium Infernum happens to be such a game. Another way of looking at this is to say that the game has limited system resilience. This is a kind of cybernetic systems idea of like everyone knows the positive feedback, negative feedback, like the cars in Mario Kart. If you're falling behind, they slow down. If you're getting ahead, they speed up. So that idea of that negative feedback, right, it tends to create a stable state. Or positive feedback would be like, the more I win in StarCraft, the more I win because the more resources I have. Resilience is another way of saying negative feedback or rubber banding. Solium Infernum has a lot of positive feedback or snowball effect-ness. I love this image as an illustration of that. And this is intentional. The game has very, very high stakes, but very, very few actions that the player has available. The idea being that you really think about each action because each action could be the one that tips things over in your favor, right? And it also encourages things like, plotting with other players, betrayal, etc., paranoia about what someone else might do to pull the rug out from under you. And they make the world feel dark and hostile. They make you feel clever, very much like in Dark Souls, which is why we call the game the Dark Souls of strategy games, because Dark Souls would be another example of a game with very limited system resilience. You're doing really, really well, and then suddenly you mess up a roll and you die. Get that big "you died" message. So I don't have, once again, a lot of time left, so I'm going to rush through this a little bit, I'm afraid. But here's how, for Solium, we got around the issue of these tipping points. The basic idea is as follows. Bear with me. There are about 70 possible combatants. That's including the legions and also the places of power, so the buildings. What if we just created a table of every possible fight that might occur, and we just simulated it in Excel? And so we did. So here, first line, you just grab the top and control and pull down, and that'll give you every single number. Second column is just that first number divided by the number of contenders, so divided by 70. And the third one is the modulo, so that's the remainder left over from that division. So, 2 divided by 70 is 0 plus, 0 times 70 plus 2. And by doing this, we can create every single pairing in our table. Now, previously I said that a fight would always involve a ranged phase, a melee phase, and an infernal phase. I lied. Actually, there are ways of overriding this. So there are some special abilities that cause a phase to be repeated or withdrawn or pushed backwards or forwards. Yeah. What that means is that we need for each of these match-offs to have some way of knowing what is the actual sequence of rounds that are going to occur. For this, we use a lookup table. So essentially, if a given legion has an ability that does some kind of override, then we will look up that ability in this lovely little table over here, and we can find out which attribute is going to be checked in which round. Of course, it wouldn't be Solium if there weren't also possible conflicts between these sequence overrides, but we can use a lookup table for that as well. So if we have two different sequence overrides that conflict, this is a due idea that's built by concatenating the two abilities together with the comparison of levels in between them, and then we can look up each of those possibilities and the one that wins. So in this case, the beast's range last would beat the Gorgon's melee last. And then that means that we can create a lovely table of all 29,400 combat rounds. So that is 6 rounds for each of the 4,900 possible matchups. And we can see over here, we've got the attacking contender, the defending contender. We'll have the round, so 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we have our lovely lookup table that allows us to look up what attribute's going to be checked in that round. And then when we know what attribute to check, we can use a little X lookup to grab the strength and resistance, so how much the defender can suffer before they take damage. And then each row is calculated on the basis of the previous row, again using an X lookup. So for instance, here we have on round 1 the maximum hit points of the attacker. However, they take 1 damage on the basis of the comparison of attributes, and so the next round they start with 5 hit points, which is their maximum minus the sum of all the damage that they've taken in previous rounds, using a little sum ifs. So what does this give us? Well, it gives us essentially a total of how much damage every legion deals and takes, were it to fight every other possible legion in the game. And that is how this power curve was actually generated, right? And interestingly as well, what it means is that we don't need to come up by hand with values for some of these exotic abilities like range last or melee first or whatever. It's very difficult to understand what is that worth because it's extremely contextual. But we can just simulate how much it's worth by looking at the roster of every possible other legion. And this will run in just a couple of seconds in Excel, because Excel is great. Did I mention Excel's great? It does take a few seconds to calculate, but it takes a lot less time than it does to run Unity. And one thing I do want to stress as well is this filtering and sorting. So because I've created this whole thing as a table, I can essentially go in and say, oh, I want all the round 6s, or I want all the attacker level 1s, or I want all the level comparisons which are, equal. So I want all the fair fights. And I can really dig into exactly, each round that occurred in each of those fights. So other examples, give me all the fights that ended in a stalemate, because we have that final result column on the right there. Give me all the ones using starting legions, the ones that I mentioned before that have no cost. They're all on the left side of the chart, that last at least 5 rounds, or all of the above. So it's very handy. And when there are high-level, constraints that we want to impose on ourselves, like for instance, none of the starting legions should be able to capture one of these neutral places of power unassisted. This is a really good way of ensuring that. So this is another table, which is a kind of a summary, like a high-level summary, where we're looking at, all of the attackers from this category, how do they fare against this specific contender? So contender is either a legion or a place of power. And we can get a lot of metrics here, and that can allow us to, ensure that, none of the starting legions can defeat any other starting legion in one turn or whatever. Epilogue. This worked pretty well for us. The game has gone through a few tests at this point, and essentially the response to the legion balancing has been very positive. We've not had people pulling us up and saying, your game is completely broken, which they love to do for places where it is. So I feel like this area has gone relatively well. And I think that's down to the tooling around the legions. And this is important and useful. You can burn out your testers, right? You can burn them out testing things that aren't very interesting. So ideally, you want to catch all this stuff early. If a mathematical formula can catch it, then have a mathematical formula catch it, rather than wasting QA and play tester time, right? You're probably thinking, well, why didn't, if this is a simulation, why didn't you just write it in your engine rather than using an external tool? The reason for that is, well, that way we didn't monopolize a programmer, and we kept control over it, but also it meant that it was seamlessly part of the source of truth, right, the spreadsheets. And that meant that, we could run it immediately, easily. We didn't have to go through a whole import-export step or anything like that. We could get really good visualization tools in Excel. But yeah, things to be aware of. So the brain is a great big pattern matching machine, right? And a lot of what we do is about creating and breaking patterns. You break an established pattern, it creates a feeling of delight and intrigue. So, it was Leonardo da Vinci who said that the reins, or the perspective, is the reins of the artist. You need to understand how to create a pattern in order to break it as a designer. But if you follow it too slavishly, the game is going to be super boring. And we've all seen examples of this, of games that the content is created in too much of a kind of mechanical manner, right? And I'm definitely, I definitely have this tendency. You can get distracted working on your model when you should be working on your game, making your model perfect, making it perfectly reflect, how good a piece of content is or whatever. So we really need to keep in mind that this is just a lens. This is just an additional tool on your tool belt. This is not like a paradigm or this is not a religion. But, it is something to consider, and hopefully the stuff that I've discussed will be useful for all of you when you are working on your games. So yeah, that's my talk. Thank you. I think we have like 60 seconds for questions. 2 minutes, fantastic. Any questions? Yes, sir. Yeah.
I was just curious, so you've done a great job, obviously, of mapping that power curve to the super balance. But is it a PvP game or is it a single player game?
Yeah. So the question is, or is that your whole?
That was a pretty.
It is a PvP game.
Okay, great. So how do you the idea of things being too balanced so that it doesn't create interesting gameplay? Is that something that you factored into that power balance? Like I noticed the Devourer, for example, I think was like super powerful, but actually not as efficient to build, which is interesting, right?
Yes.
That's a great unit, but it's going to suck to cost. So is that something you've considered with your tuning?
So the question is, if you allow me to summarize, have we allowed in some way, in some specific way, for content that is deliberately not kind of balanced to the curve, right? Great question. Yes, so what I feel, right, is that you kind of have hero content in a certain sense, which is stuff that is so game-breaking, so weird, that you kind of just consider it off on its own, separately. And we do have pieces of content like that, like the Devourer typically. It doesn't follow the usual rules, and, the idea is that you choose your battles, what is going to be game-breaking. You intentionally, say, okay, this is going to be balanced by hand, tuned by hand. What these tools are, they're more for the body of the kind of the rest of the content, that you don't want to have to worry about every single thing doing it by hand, if you see what I mean. So, yeah, great question. I hope that answered your question. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
At the beginning, you showed though, like the initial sort of formula where you had times all these different factors by number to get a general overview of everything.
Yeah.
What was the process of figuring out what factors need to be time figuring by in order for it to reflect accurately what you're looking for?
So the question is for the sort of power heuristic where we were saying that a legion's value is, 10 times range plus 9 times, et cetera, et cetera. What was the process for getting that? Honestly, iteration. You start with gut feeling. You go, I feel like this is a decent evaluation, and then you look at your curve, the resulting curve, and you say, the model is saying that this particular unit is very strong, but I kind of don't think it is. So what's going on here? I think this is weighted too high, and then you just kind of iterate like that. But again, you can get lost in that iteration and spend way too long, making the math go brr. All right, one final question, sir. Yeah.
Great talk.
Thank you.
So you mentioned at the end that the power curve was based on Fight Club rankings, isn't it?
Yes.
So was that based on how many other units they could beat at the same cost, or how did you use that?
Okay, so the question is, given that the final power curve's kind of y-axis is based on the results of Fight Club, the kind of battle royale thing, where did we get a value between 0 and 1, given that we have a total damage calculated against every other unit? It's complicated. So that actually comes back to, some linear combination of, we're taking into consideration like the average number of remaining hit points that the unit has and the average amount of damage that it does, the average number of, not the average number, the number of victories, the number of defeats. So it's kind of win-loss ratio. And all of these things are kind of taken into consideration to a varying degree. In that kind of final power heuristic. So it's a really complicated power heuristic when you think of it. We'll just simulate like 29,000 fights, and then we'll take all of that and we'll kind of do some linear combination of some kind. But yeah. All right, fantastic. Well, listen, thank you all very much for your time. And I will put these up online somewhere. You can find me here and poke me if I forget. Please enjoy the rest of GCAP.